I want to get into another kind of question, evolving, something you might have thought was set in stone. They say the only thing that's sure in life is death and taxes. And of course, we still are being taxed. But the question is, there's been some recent changes. There's some possible changes on the horizon. What is this going to mean for you as a taxpayer? What is it going to mean for the business you work for? Our next guest is here to answer these very important questions. And this part of the show is brought to you by Interactive Brokers and CME Groups. Visit interactivebrokers.com/CME Futures to learn more. Mark Everson is a former IRS Commissioner. He's Vice Chairman at the Alliant Group, which provides specialty tax services to companies across the country. Mark, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks for having me.
So for starters, let's look at the payroll tax cut. What's going on there? What kind of impact has this had on small and medium businesses?
Well, if you look at what has been done for the current year, it's not a cut, if you're a holiday, if you will, for the business side of that contribution. It's for the employee, the actual employee, him or her. And it's real money, as everybody has said, estimated around $1,000, and that's good for businesses because what it does is it props up or continues the aggregate demand. That money is something that people, they don't see it in one lump sum like a rebate check or a check in some of the earlier programs or the earned income tax credit when somebody files their annual tax return. This is something that comes each week or every 2 weeks when they're paid, so it's just helpful in relatively small but important amounts all year long for the individuals, and that helps businesses, of course.
How important was it to continue it then? Because I think that's been the debate, right? How much difference does it make if people know it's temporary? Does it really change behavior? Does it really change the economy? In the end, you know, both sides of the aisle agreed on this. But as you look at taxes and study taxes and look at this question of the macroeconomy and how much it's affected, what's your view?
Well, I think that what you're getting at is a broader question, and that's about stability of the tax code. I think all parties at this point recognize that the constant series of short-term provisions and changes. I mean, I'll tell you one quick story. When I was running the service back at the end of 2006, Congress didn't act on a series of extenders until I think it was Christmas Eve. And tens of millions of people couldn't even file their returns in January because we program, when I was to service, they still do this, you program against the current law. You don't program against the law that has yet to be enacted. So there's just chaos that goes from this. Businesses need to plan. Individuals need to plan. Clearly, as in this instance of the payroll tax, it helped the demand, but you're exactly right. You want stability. Businesses want to plan, knowing what the law is going to be for a period of years.
Brian, or Mark, I'm sorry, my head is back still in a different interview, but you know, a lot of the guests that we have on here say that there's widespread agreement that the whole tax code needs to be overhauled. And, you know, we look at the individual candidates' tax plans and we wait for them to each bring out their own. But the basic thing that needs to be done, it seems, in the US is a complete overhaul. What needs to happen on the political side of things for that to actually be viable?
Well, I think that it's sad but true that we need to get through the election. I think that is coloring all the conversation at this time. That having been said, I do think that there's an acceptance on both sides of the aisle and within the administration and on the part of the political candidates or the presidential candidates on the Republican side that tax reform is coming. I don't think that was so clear, let's say, a year ago. Let me just say, the way this really works is congressmen and senators, they get reelected because they've cut a better deal for their constituents or their industries back home. And they do that by getting a special provision so that their folks do better. That breeds to complexity in the code. It makes it harder and harder to navigate the code. It makes for more opportunities for non-compliance and nefarious actions.
So what makes you think overhaul is coming then?
I think that there's a level of frustration that has now arisen that it's become an issue. And I give Herman Cain a lot of credit on this. 999. It was catchy, and it put the issue squarely in the middle of the political conversation. That's a plus. But that particular program, I don't think, was a sensible solution. But if you will, This is now a part of the dialogue, so I'm hopeful that something will happen come the new year.
Well, and of course, we'll have the next president in the White House, and we've gotten through this election year, so maybe there is some scope for this. Certainly, there are a lot of people talking very seriously about what could be and should be on the table, and that's what we're going to talk about next with Mark Everson, former IRS Commissioner, Vice Chairman of the Alliant Group. We want to talk about the shape he says and sees corporate tax reform possibly taking, how that will affect the economy, what tax credits and extenders are critical to business. There's a whole lot more on taxes next on Bloomberg Radio. We are taking a look at taxes, tax changes that have been made and tax changes that may be made, to ask what they're going to mean for businesses and the economy, and maybe even for your own tax planning purposes. Mark Everson is a former IRS Commissioner. He's Vice Chairman of the Alliant Group. They provide specialized tax services to companies and individuals across the country. And Mark, let's talk about corporate tax reform, because you see that as something that is fairly likely to happen. We hear a lot of talk about leveling the playing field, right? So do away with exemptions and lower the tax rate so that everybody pays something, but nobody can, knock on their favorite congressman's door and make a donation, or, get the lobbyist in there to get their special tax break. Are large corporations, are businesses really ready to give up this system without a fight?
Well, here's the point. I think you just sort of, the way you phrase this, you talk about corporate tax reform. That's not the conversation we need to have. We need to have a conversation about business tax reform, and that should be done as part, as Chairman Camp has said, along with individual tax reform. If you only talk about corporations, you end up talking about the big players. It needs to talk about all businesses, and frankly, a great deal of the economic activity of the country, it's flow-throughs and it's people doing business as individuals and then taking the business activity on their return. At Alliant, we work with smaller and mid-sized businesses, 100 million, 300, 500 million, and they are not subject to the same set of issues that the big
So what is their
are.
issue? You mentioned flow-throughs. Is that one of the key aspects that they differ on, and a place where smaller and mid-sized businesses aren't going to want to give up what some people might say is a system that works for them but doesn't promote tax efficiency and equality?
Well, that's a very real issue, because if what you do is you get rid of certain things like the R&D credit, we think is terribly important, and I applaud the president. Let me say this. The fact that the president has put out the outline of a plan, it's about time. That's a good thing. This won't happen unless the administration leads, but you can't just get rid of everything and simplify everything. While that's laudable, without incentivizing things that need to be done. Manufacturing's important. Innovation's important, and he's got that in there. There's some who disagree with that. Our main counsel is to make sure you're looking at the impacts of this across the smaller and mid-sized businesses. They, after all, employ two-thirds of the working individuals in this country. And many of them, frankly, they're creating jobs here. They're not doing things overseas. Unfortunately, too much of the conversation has been about getting money back from overseas and worldwide global tax schemes, that sort of thing. And I guess my worry would be that the conversation about the continuity between individual taxes and business taxes could get disturbed and lost if we only focus on the big corporations.
We're speaking with Mark Everson, former IRS Commissioner and Vice Chairman of Alliant Group. This portion of the Hayes Advantage, brought to you by Prestige Land Rover, the world's largest volume Land Rover dealer, is now offering exceptional lease and purchase terms for the all-new 2012 Prestige Range Rover Evoque. Reserve your Range Rover today only at prestigelandrover.com. Well, Mark, have you done any math, or have you any statistics on what you think small and medium-sized businesses might save, should more simplified tax agenda, say, go into effect?
I don't have a number, and that's because the devil is in the details here. The president and others have laid out frameworks, but when you're in the tax world, you have to look at the specifics of each provision and see where you get to. But I would say this clearly, there are billions of dollars that are incurred in terms of the additional complexity of the code. And let's go back to where you started this conversation. It's also about stability. Businesses want to make decisions, and I would say it's even more important for small and mid-sized businesses to have a view of what's going to be like for the next 5 or 10 years, and a certainty that if they're going to invest, that they're going to get that return. So that's important too.
Well, In terms of an ideal tax system, where should we start? I mean, and is it your sense that your clients agree that it's fair and appropriate that they pay taxes? I mean, is that the first starting point? Is everybody on board saying, sure, we'll pay, we just want to pay our fair share, whatever that is?
Yes, in my experience, both working with Alliant Group and also at the service, nobody loves paying taxes. Come on, we all know that. But they mainly want to see that it's fair and that somebody else isn't getting a deal that they're not getting. At the same time, I do think that we all recognize in today's world there's a need for us as a country to be competitive in areas like research and development, manufacturing. I look at it this way: they're not going to move my home to China, but they can move factories that are in the neighboring county to India.
Should there be a flat tax?
I believe in progressivity, and I think that's been an important historic centerpiece of our system for the last century. But that doesn't mean that you can't do a great deal to simplify it and get it down to a narrower band of differentiation.
What about, since you mentioned China, what about a global minimum tax regime?
Well, again, we have a very complicated scheme right now. There's conversation about moving to a territorial system, and then the administration's come back with global tax. I think that'll be fairly tough to enforce. If again, the devil in the details here. I'm not sure how you can make it work, because you're going to have to capture much of the same information that you supposedly already do in this system that clearly isn't working, where we're trying to touch all the worldwide income.
When it comes to Republicans and Democrats, we often think of them as being at loggerheads. What about this relationship and how it's affected the development of the deal? Is it as divided as we think, or do they share some common ground that we don't see as we watch this in Washington?
Well, in my experience, and also I think looking at it both as a commissioner and looking at it now, I think that the two tax writing committees, that's Ways and Means in the House and Finance in the Senate, they work pretty well together. This is such a technical area. They cooperate. They talk a great deal. I think this is something of an outlier from most of the politics that go on in Washington. But the key here is, if it's only going to work, as it did in '86 under Reagan, if all parties, the administration and both chambers of the legislature, get together and say, this is a priority, they can make it work.
Well, Mark Everson, thank you so much for joining us. He's a former IRS Commissioner, also Vice Chairman of Alliant Group. We'll definitely have you back as we see more details emerge about the different candidates' tax plans. You're listening to the